Today we will look at several interesting and informative facts about the pharaohs. So let's not wait long and move on to the first fact, which will reveal the topic of the pharaoh himself in more detail. Understanding the role of the pharaoh in ancient Egypt is an important but complex fact for understanding this large and long-lasting civilization. The pharaoh was not simply a supreme ruler with absolute power, as is often the case in other monarchies. He was much more. He was the living embodiment of the divine on earth, the direct link between the world of gods and the world of people, the center around which the entire Egyptian world revolved, both in its visible and invisible incarnations. This unique concept of the deified king, rooted in ancient times, was formed and developed over more than 3 millennia, affecting every sphere of Egyptian life, from religious rituals and art to the economic system and complex political hierarchy. The fate of Egypt, its prosperity, security, and even its very existence were directly linked to the figure of the pharaoh, his ability to maintain order. You are probably wondering how exactly the pharaohs came to be, and I will tell you that the very idea of the pharaoh's power was based on the idea of his divine origin. According to ancient beliefs, each pharaoh was not just chosen, but actually born from the union of God with his earthly mother, the ruling queen, or even a simple mortal woman. This act of divine conception and birth was carefully documented and propagated through temple inscriptions, and this in turn served as a powerful tool for recognizing power. For example, on the walls of the Luxor temple, Pharaoh Amenhotep III was shown in a grand series of scenes detailing his divine conception, birth, and recognition by the gods, demonstrating his supernatural origin and right to the throne. Even if the pharaoh was not a direct patrilineal heir, the myth of divine conception was adapted to justify his reign, emphasizing that his accession to the throne was decreed by the gods themselves. This connection with the divine world was reflected in the complex and multi-layered title of the pharaoh, which developed throughout the early dynasties and reached its full development by the Middle Kingdom. The full royal protocol included 5 great names, each of which was placed in a specific decoration and symbolized different aspects of his divine and earthly power. Now we will examine these sides of power in more detail, and the first side was the Horus name, because it was the most ancient name of the pharaoh, which connected him with the god Horus, the heavenly falcon, the patron of royal power, and the symbol of the legitimate king. This name was usually placed in a serek. It was a stylized image of the palace, decorated with the falcon of Horus. It emphasized his earthly manifestation as a living Horus, the protector of Egypt. It was also the name of the two lady. It symbolized his power over the united Egypt, representing the patron goddesses of Upper Egypt and Lower Egypt. This name often began with the formula, "he to whom the two lady belong," and affirmed him as the protector of the 2 parts of the country. One should not forget about the Golden Horus name, and its exact meaning remains controversial, but it was often associated with the Golden Horus. It is believed that it could represent the triumph of Horus over Seth, or the eternal reign of the pharaoh. There was also a throne name, which was taken by the pharaoh upon accession to the throne and often included the name of the sun god Ra. This name was placed in a cartouche and emphasized his connection with Ra, the supreme creator god. But there was also a personal name, which was the name given to the pharaoh at birth, also written in a cartouche, and was his main name in everyday life. This name, unlike the others, did not always have a direct meaning, but over time it also became part of the divine royal protocol. Each of these titles not only listed the functions of the pharaoh, but also asserted his divine affiliation, irreplaceable role, and undeniable power over Egypt. But it is also worth mentioning that the entire Egyptian ideology of pharaonic power was based on the concept of Ma'at, not just a goddess with a feather on her head, but also the principle of truth, justice, harmony, order, balance, and the correct world order. The pharaoh was the main keeper and protector of Ma'at. His main task was to maintain this divine order in the world of the living, reflecting and reproducing the original cosmic balance that was established by the gods when creating the world. Maintaining Ma'at was a continuous, active process that included several features. The first feature was the daily performance of rituals. The pharaoh was the high priest of all the cults of Egypt. He personally, or through his deputies, who were high priests, performed complex rituals in the temples daily, entering the most sacred parts of the sanctuaries, where mere mortals were forbidden access. These rituals included awakening the gods, ablutions and burning incense, making sacrifices and reciting hymns. It was also believed that these actions appeased the gods, ensuring their favor and therefore the fertility of the Nile, abundant harvests, protection from diseases, stability and prosperity of the country. The absence of these rituals or their incorrect performance could lead to the violation of Maat, causing chaos, famine, drought, epidemics, and even enemy invasions. It is known that the pharaoh was the supreme judge and the source of all laws. He issued decrees and laws that established norms and maintained justice in society. Violating laws was considered not only a crime against the pharaoh, but also against Maat, and this could upset the cosmic balance and entail the wrath of the gods. A staff or rod often served as a symbol of his judicial power. Even the military campaigns of the pharaohs were justified by the maintenance of Maat. Conquering Egypt's enemies was seen as suppressing chaos and spreading the pharaoh's divine order to new lands. Images of the pharaoh defeating enemies with a mace were ubiquitous on temple pylons and steles, symbolizing his role as an invincible defender of order from external threats. And the construction of grand temples, tombs, obelisks, and statues was not just an act of construction, but an act of maintaining Maat, glorifying the gods, ensuring the pharaoh's eternal life, and affirming the stability of the Egyptian world. These monuments were testaments to the pharaoh's ability to command resources and human power for the divine order. It is worth mentioning that for the ancient Egyptians, the pharaoh was the living axis around which the entire world revolved. His health, well-being, moral qualities, and successful rule directly influenced the fate of the entire country. Drought, famine, natural disasters, external invasions, or internal troubles, all this could be perceived as a direct weakening of the pharaoh or his inability to maintain Maat. Thus, his wisdom, strength, piety, and devotion to order were important for the survival and prosperity of Egypt. Society was organized into a strict hierarchy, at the top of which was the pharaoh. Below him were the viziers, high priests, military leaders, nomarchs, scribes, and officials, and then the common people. This entire complex system was aimed at serving the pharaoh, who ensured the well-being of Egypt through the tireless maintenance of Maat. The death of the pharaoh, in turn, did not mean the end of his divine role, but rather a transformation. It was believed that after death he was compared to Osiris, the god of the underworld, resurrection, and eternal rule. This transformation was the key to his eternal life and the continuation of his influence on Egypt from the world of the dead. Grandiose funerary structures, from the early cult pyramids to the hidden tombs in the Valley of the Kings, were carefully designed and built to ensure the successful journey of the pharaoh to the afterlife and his immortality. Mummification, complex burial rituals, a huge number of funerary offerings. All this was aimed at ensuring that he could successfully overcome all the trials of the afterlife, join the gods, and continue his divine mission, invisibly supporting Maat and protecting Egypt. Thus, the pharaoh was not just a ruler, but also an eternal spiritual center, a living god, on whom depended the very existence of the Egyptian world, both on earth and in the afterlife, symbolizing the inseparable connection between the divine, human, and cosmic order. The second fact about the pharaohs was their large-scale pyramids and temples, as well as sanctuaries. It is well known that the construction activity of the pharaohs was the most famous and impressive aspect of their reign, which left behind unprecedented monuments that still amaze the imagination with their scale, precision, and durability. These projects, from early mastabas to pyramids, from rock-cut tombs to temple complexes and obelisks, served not only burial purposes but also acted as powerful symbols of the absolute power of the pharaoh, his divine significance, the unprecedented engineering skills of the ancient Egyptians, and, most importantly, the belief in immortality and eternal greatness. Each such structure was not just a building, but a carefully planned statement about the pharaoh's power and the permanence of the Egyptian world order. The early burials of Egyptian rulers were relatively simple pits, later developing into rectangular mud brick structures known as mastabas. However, the turning point came at the beginning of the Old Kingdom with the construction of the step pyramid of Pharaoh Djoser at Saqqara. Designed by the legendary vizier and architect Imhotep, this first monumental stone building in human history was revolutionary. It consisted of 6 gradually smaller mastabas, stacked on top of each other, symbolizing the ladder for the pharaoh's soul to ascend to the stars. The step pyramid not only showed what all future pyramids would look like, but also proved that Egypt could muster enormous forces and people to build something grandiose. But the culmination of the Old Kingdom's building fever were the famous pyramids at Giza, built for the pharaohs of the 4th dynasty, Khufu, Khafre, and Menkaura in the middle of the 3rd millennium BC. A striking example was, of course, the Great Pyramid of Cheops, the only one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world that has survived to this day. Initially, its height was about 146 meters, and about 2 million limestone and granite blocks were used in its construction. The average weight of a block was 2 tons, but some monoliths, especially in the burial chamber, reached even 80 tons. It is obvious that the construction of such large structures required incredible organization of labor, logistics, and technical knowledge. Stone was brought from distant quarries, white limestone for the facing from Tura on the east bank of the Nile, and red granite for the inner chambers from Aswan, more than 800 kilometers to the south. They were transported along the Nile on huge barges, and then along specially built ramps to the construction site. But contrary to popular myth, the pyramids were not built by slaves in the classical sense, but by organized and well-off workers. These were highly skilled craftsmen, as well as farmers who came to work during the Nile flood season, when their fields were flooded and agricultural work could not be organized. Archaeological finds near Giza, such as settlements of builders, bakeries, breweries, and even hospitals, testified to a developed infrastructure and working conditions that could provide for tens of thousands of people at that time. But it is worth saying that the pyramids were not just tombs. They were part of large complexes with temples and roads. These complexes showed how the pharaoh is connected with the gods, how he gets to the afterlife and rules there forever. The very shape of the pyramid resembled a hill from which, according to the Egyptians, everything began. And this meant that the soul of the pharaoh rises to the solar gods and remains in space forever. After a period of instability and the expulsion of the Hyksos, the pharaohs of the New Kingdom turned their energies to the construction of enormous temples. These structures were not only centers of state worship, but also powerful instruments for glorifying the pharaoh and his achievements. The construction of such temples could last for decades, sometimes centuries, with the participation of several generations of pharaohs, each in turn adding their own pylons, courtyards, columned halls, and sanctuaries. I want to tell you a little more about the Karnak temple complex in Thebes, because it is the largest religious building in the world, which developed over almost 2 millennia. Open courtyards, giant columned halls such as the famous hypostyle hall, numerous sanctuaries, obelisks, sacred lakes, and storehouses. Each pharaoh wanted to leave his mark on Karnak, adding new sections, dedications, or rebuilding existing ones, making it a new architectural document of Egyptian history. Luxor Temple cannot be ignored because it was also dedicated to the Theban triad and was closely connected to Karnak by a majestic avenue of sphinxes stretching for almost 3 kilometers. It served as the site of the annual Opet festival, when the statues of the gods were solemnly transferred from Karnak to Luxor, and symbolized the renewal and rebirth of divine power and royal authority. Let's move on to the next type of temples, namely the mortuary temples of the pharaohs. They were built on the west bank of the Nile in Thebes and were intended to hold funerary cults for the deceased pharaohs and their next generation. Among them, the majestic temple of Hatshepsut in Deir el-Bahari stands out. It was an unusual terraced structure carved into the rocks, designed by its architect Senmut. And of course, the colossal Medinet Habu of Rameses III, decorated with detailed reliefs depicting the military victories of the pharaoh and his ritual actions. These temples were decorated with reliefs and hieroglyphic inscriptions that showed military exploits, religious ceremonies, and scenes from the life of the pharaoh, thereby guaranteeing his immortality and glorification for many years. Finally, I would like to mention the power, propaganda, and economic impact. These large constructions were not just a manifestation of religious or artistic taste. They were powerful instruments of political power and propaganda. Pharaohs could gather tens of thousands of workers, bring in materials from all over the country, and even to carry out huge construction projects. This showed that their power was given by the gods, and that they could rule all of Egypt. Such constructions provided work for many people and developed various crafts. They also developed trade because it was necessary to supply wood, metals, food, and tools. All this helped to strengthen the country's economy. But in order to manage such large projects, a strict system and clear organization were needed. This helped the pharaoh to further strengthen his power over the entire country. Every new building, every gate or great statue was a constant reminder to the people of the greatness of the pharaoh, and that order in Egypt was created and maintained by a divine ruler. And we are gradually moving on to the third fact, and it is about the diplomacy of the pharaoh. Since military power and smart diplomacy were also the main foundations of the pharaoh's power, they created the image of the pharaoh as a divine ruler and invincible defender of Egypt. And the pharaoh, being a military leader, was responsible for the security of the country, its prosperity and expansion of influence. This activity lasted for 1,000 years, from the first misunderstandings with the nomads to the creation of large empires and the signing of the first international peace treaties in history. This showed how well developed the system of relations between Egypt and other countries was. You might be wondering now what the very first military goals of rulers were. I will tell you that in ancient Egypt, during the Old and Middle Kingdoms, the pharaohs defended their borders from those who wanted to invade. From the east and northeast, Egypt was threatened by Asian tribes, such as the Canaanites. From the west, the Libyans attacked from the desert oases, and from the south, the Nubian tribes. These conflicts were not just wars for land. The Egyptians truly believed that this was a fight against chaos, which threatened the order that the Egyptian state and the pharaoh himself represented. Therefore, by defending themselves, the pharaohs maintained world order. But in addition to defense, military campaigns also helped Egypt obtain necessary and valuable resources. For example, campaigns in Nubia were very frequent and brutal. This region was the main source of gold, which was vital for Egypt to remain rich, and the temples and pharaonic life were at a high level. The pharaohs of the Middle Kingdom, such as Senusret I and especially Senusret III, conducted many campaigns in Nubia. They built a system of powerful fortresses there along the Nile River. These fortresses not only protected the borders, but also helped control trade and gold mining, as well as suppress rebellions. The Egyptians also sent expeditions to the Sinai Peninsula for turquoise and copper, and to the Levant for valuable wood such as cedar, which Egypt was in dire shortage of. The pharaoh, when he led the troops himself, or entrusted this to trusted generals, was always depicted in the poses of a warrior who defeated enemies with his mace. This showed his main role as an invincible protector and the one who guaranteed the prosperity of Egypt. Such monuments still amaze our imagination because they were living proof of the incredible achievements of the ancient Egyptian civilization under the leadership of their pharaohs. And the culmination of military power and diplomatic activity was during the New Kingdom, when Egypt turned into a powerful empire, stretching from the Fourth Nile Cataract in the south to the Euphrates River in the north. Egypt was able to expand its lands due to the fact that it had a professional, well-trained and organized army. Let's look at it in a little more detail. This army, of course, included infantry. This was the backbone of the army, consisting of archers, spearmen and swordsmen. And chariots were the advanced military technology of the time. The Egyptians improved the chariots that they borrowed from the Hyksos. Their chariots were light, fast, and had 2 wheels. Each chariot had 2 people. The first was a charioteer, and the second was an archer. This made them very powerful and allowed them to maneuver in battle. To create and maintain them, a lot of resources and skilled workers were required. Do not forget about the navy. Although it is not as famous as the land army, the navy played an important role in logistics and transporting troops along the Nile and along the coast of the Levant. I think everyone is interested to know about the outstanding military pharaohs of the New Kingdom. One of them was Thutmose III. He was called the Napoleon of Egypt because of his great number of military victories. He led no less than 17 successful campaigns in Syria, Lebanon, Palestine, and Nubia. His most famous battle was the Battle of Megiddo. It was considered one of the first well-documented battles in history. Thutmose III was able to surprise the enemy by choosing a short but dangerous mountain route to bypass them and defeat them. After his victories, Thutmose III established Egyptian control over the region. He collected tribute, gold, silver, cattle, slaves, from subject states. He also sent the children of local rulers to Egypt to be raised at court. This helped ensure their loyalty and spread Egyptian culture. Amenhotep III was also quite an interesting pharaoh. Although he is known as the Pharaoh of the Sun and a great builder, he also maintained a vast empire, primarily using diplomatic methods. His reign is often called the Golden Age of Egyptian diplomacy, as evidenced by Amarna letters. And the third pharaoh I will tell you about was Seti I and his son Ramses II. They actively fought the rising Hittite Empire for control of the Levant and were renowned rulers. A striking example of diplomacy was the first peace treaty in history. In fact, the Battle of Kadesh was one of the most important and well-recorded military clashes of the New Kingdom. It pitted the army of Pharaoh Ramesses III against the Hittite king Muwatalli II. It was one of the largest chariot battles in the ancient world. Thousands of war chariots clashed for control of the strategically important city of Kadesh in Syria, which controlled key trade routes. Egyptian sources, such as the poem of Pentor and extensive temple reliefs, described the battle as a personal triumph for Ramesses II. They claimed that he, in a display of prodigious bravery, was able to break through the enemy lines single-handedly and save his army from defeat. But modern historians, when they studied the records of the Egyptians and Hittites, believed that the battle ended in a draw or even defeat for the Egyptians. Since they were unable to take Kadesh, both sides then suffered heavy losses and no one gained any advantage. This started the long and difficult period of stalemate in the following years. After a decade of mutually exhausting clashes and the realization that neither side could completely subjugate the other, Ramesses II and the Hittite king Hattusili III concluded what is known as the Eternal Treaty. This document, which is still considered the first known international peace treaty in history, preserved in both Egyptian and Hittite versions. It in turn contained the official end of all hostile actions and a promise not to attack each other, mutual assistance in case of attack by a third party, extradition of political fugitives and common criminals, which was unprecedented for that time and testified to a high level of trust, and the consolidation of the alliance by marriage of Ramesses II with a Hittite princess, which was a common practice for strengthening diplomatic ties between ruling houses. But in addition to wars, the pharaohs were also actively engaged in complex diplomatic relations with other major countries in the region, such as Mitanni, Babylonia, Assyria, and the Hittite Empire, as well as with numerous small vassal and client states in the Levant. There were the Amarna letters, a unique collection of more than 350 clay tablets found in Akhetaten, the capital of Pharaoh Akhenaten. These letters were diplomatic correspondence between the pharaohs Amenhotep III and Akhenaten with rulers of other countries and their own vassals. They revealed the complex world of ancient diplomacy, and it included several features, the first of which was the exchange of gifts, for example gold from Egypt, which was considered almost inexhaustible, in exchange for horses, lapis lazuli, timber, silver, and other valuable goods. These gifts were not just gifts, but symbols of status and mutual respect. Also, the rulers of the vassal city-states in the Levant often wrote to the pharaoh, asking for military aid against their rivals or Hapiru invasions. But we should not forget about dynastic marriages. As already mentioned, marriages between royal families were a powerful tool for strengthening alliances. There were also correspondences between so-called brothers, which meant that rulers of equal status called each other brother, emphasizing their status and mutual respect, even in the presence of hidden threats or rivalry. And of course, in those days, it was impossible to do without intrigues and various complaints. Letters were filled with complaints about disloyal vassals, accusations of violating treaties, and even requests for the pharaoh's intervention in the internal affairs of other countries. And so the pharaohs carried out a variety of military and diplomatic activities. They used different strategies. They were both aggressive conquests and the creation of empires, and of course, the conclusion of peace treaties and complex correspondence. These activities protected Egypt and strengthened the status of the pharaoh as a major figure in the turbulent ancient world. It showed his ability to manage both force and negotiations. Meanwhile, we are moving on to the fourth fact that will tell us about the daily life of the pharaoh. In fact, the life of the pharaoh may seem almighty and sacred, but in reality, his life was very complicated. It combined sacred rites, heavy state duties, as well as human hobbies, recreation, intrigue, and of course drama, as at any great court. Despite the fact that the pharaoh was officially considered a kind of living god, on earth he was still a man. His daily life, although much more luxurious and privileged than that of ordinary Egyptians, was still subject to biological needs, communication, and the laws of the body. The study of archaeological finds, papyri, temple reliefs, and especially the mummies of the pharaohs themselves allowed us to learn more about their personal lives, health, and even eating habits. We learned that every day of the pharaoh began before dawn and was filled with strict religious rituals that were considered vital to the maintenance of cosmic order and the well-being of all Egypt. The life of the pharaoh began with a special ritual of awakening the god. He, or specially trained priests, conducted morning ceremonies in the most sacred parts of the temple, where no one was allowed to enter. They opened the sanctuary, washed, perfumed, and dressed the statue of the god, offering it food and drink, and then sealed the sanctuary again. These actions were indeed very important. The Egyptians believed that in this way they could literally feed the gods, gaining their favor, ensuring order in the world, the Nile flooding, a good harvest, and, most importantly, protection from chaos. But after religious duties came the time for state affairs. The pharaoh held daily meetings, where he received reports from his chief ministers and officials. Let's take a closer look at the structure of these workers. The pharaoh's team included the viziers. They were responsible for justice, police, and management. And the treasurer, they managed money and taxes. We cannot ignore the high priests. They were the leaders of the main cults. And of course, the military leaders. The main job of the pharaoh was to consider requests, approve decrees. He also appointed and dismissed officials, made important decisions on domestic policy, economics, construction, and foreign policy. He was the most important judge, legislator, and commander-in-chief. His workday was filled with managing a huge and complex system that covered all aspects of the country's life. With such a busy day, of course, the diet of the pharaoh was the richest and most varied in ancient Egypt, and this distinguished him from the majority of the population. The main products, as for ordinary Egyptians, were bread and beer, but the pharaoh was served the most exquisite varieties of the best grain. Meat was present on his table every day: beef, lamb, goat, as well as game and poultry. Fish from the Nile and the Mediterranean were also part of the diet, as well as a variety of fruits such as dates, figs, grapes, pomegranates, melons, and vegetables. Dates and honey were used for sweetening. However, despite the luxury, analysis of the mummies of the pharaohs often reveals serious health problems that were a result of their lifestyle and, sometimes, even genetic factors. These factors include dental problems, because most pharaoh mummies, including even young rulers like Tutankhamun, were found to have severe tooth wear, cavities, abscesses, and periodontitis. This was due to the hard food. Even the best bread had sand and stones that got into the grain during milling. Also, many pharaohs, especially in old age, suffered from severe arthritis, osteoporosis, and spinal changes. This could be due to a sedentary lifestyle and a rich but not always balanced diet. Metabolic diseases should not be ignored either, as some pharaohs showed signs of obesity, hardening of the arteries, and diabetes, which could have been caused by excessive consumption of sugar from fruits and honey and fatty foods. Mummies also showed signs of many diseases, including parasitic infections and tuberculosis. Tutankhamun was found to have clubfoot, as well as a severe form of malaria, which became one of the causes of his early death in combination with a broken leg. But there were also genetic defects, because the practice of intermarriage between relatives, brothers and sisters, uncles and nieces was common in royal families. It was believed that this helped to preserve the purity of the divine blood. However, this often led to the accumulation of genetic problems, as shown DNA studies of mummies. Let us now take a closer look at the hygiene and appearance of the pharaohs. Of course, maintaining an ideal physical condition and appearance was important for the pharaoh, as he had to be the perfect embodiment of divinity and Maat. Pharaohs washed themselves daily, often with the use of natron. It was a kind of natural soda that killed germs. They used aromatic oils, ointments, and incense. Usually, pharaohs shaved their heads and bodies to avoid parasites and stay clean. Instead of their own hair, they wore complex wigs made of human hair, plant fibers, or even sheep wool. These wigs were heavy and required constant care for their condition. They also actively used cosmetics. First of all, it was kohl. It not only emphasized the eyes, but also protected from the sun and had antibacterial properties due to the lead it contained. And don't forget about henna. After all, it was used to color nails, hair, and even the soles of the feet. For fresh breath and oral hygiene, use different toothpastes. They were made from salt, mint, pepper, iris, and myrrh. But you might wonder if the pharaohs never had a rest because of their busy work schedules and how they arranged their personal lives. I can tell you that in their free time the pharaohs could do different things. Hunting, for example, hippos in the Nile swamps. Lions in the desert was a popular and rather symbolic activity that showed the pharaohs' victory over chaos. Some pharaohs loved fishing or board games, for example, the famous game Senet. It had a religious meaning, symbolizing the soul's journey to the afterlife. Also, often palace life was accompanied by music. These were harps, lutes or flutes, and of course dances and luxurious banquets. But despite this, the personal life of the pharaoh was very complicated. He had a main queen who often played an important role in religious rites and politics. For example, Nefertari, the favorite wife of Ramses II, or Tiye, the influential mother of Akhenaten. But we should not forget that in addition to the main queen, the pharaoh had many other wives and concubines. This created a large harem, where complex family relationships, rivalries, and even palace intrigues often arose. A striking example was the harem conspiracy against Ramses III. In it, one of the secondary wives, Tai, tried to put her son Pentor on the throne instead of the legitimate heir. The conspiracy was eventually revealed, and its participants, including high-ranking officials and women of the harem, were severely punished. And Pentor was forced to commit suicide. And the pharaohs also sought to have as many children as possible to ensure a strong continuity of the dynasty. Many of them had dozens or even hundreds of sons and daughters who created a large and diverse royal family. Even such details as the bouquet of daisies found in the tomb of Tutankhamun, which were a gift from his wife on the sarcophagus, or the mentions of the affection of Ramesses II for his dog in the inscriptions, remind us of the human side of these divine rulers. Despite all their status, they experienced ordinary emotions like everyone else and had their hobbies and preferences. And now, finally, we come to the very last but very interesting fact about the fall of the pharaohs and the end of this entire long era. Since the history of the pharaohs covered an incredible 3,000 years of uninterrupted rule and scandalous cultural flourishing. But the history of Egypt was not a continuous triumph. On the contrary, it included various ups and downs, periods of internal conflicts, weakening of the central authority, even a number of destructive foreign invasions. This ultimately led to the complete disappearance of the unique system of pharaonic rule. The fall of this great civilization was a complex process and had many causes. It included the weakening of political power, economic difficulties, social changes, religious reforms, and the constant strengthening of external enemies, who eventually swallowed Egypt. Now I invite you to take a closer look at the various cycles and lessons of the first and second periods of Egyptian transitions. The first signs of a systemic crisis emerged toward the end of the period known as the Old Kingdom. At that time, large construction projects such as the pyramids required enormous resources and thus greatly depleted the state treasury. However, a more significant factor that undermined the central authority was the growing power of the nomarchs. Nomarchs were the rulers of provinces, or nomes. They began to pass on their positions by inheritance, which allowed them to accumulate vast landholdings, significant financial resources, and even create their own armies. Ultimately, all this gradually led to the weakening of the central authority of the pharaoh. This whole situation resulted in the onset of the first intermediate period. It was a time of chaos when Egypt actually broke up into many independent nomes, each of which was ruled by competing rulers. During that period, for obvious reasons, some troubles such as famine, civil wars, and tomb robberies intensified. This dramatically showed how much all this diverged from the previous stable order, which was based on the concept of Maat, and, in fact, was its violation. But although Egypt was eventually able to recover and reunite under the rule of the Middle Kingdom pharaohs, this episode was still a very disturbing harbinger of its future problems and showed how fragile control could be, that was based mainly in the center. A similar crisis, but with more serious consequences, occurred during the Second Intermediate Period. It was caused by the invasion of the Hyksos. They were people who came from Western Asia, and they had advanced military technology for that time, such as war chariots and composite bows. Thanks to this, they were able to capture the Nile Delta and part of Upper Egypt. At the time, the Hyksos ruled from their capital at Avaris, and although they adopted many Egyptian customs and even some aspects of the pharaohs, their government was perceived by the native Egyptians as humiliating and a direct violation of Ma'at, which contained the principle of order and justice. Ultimately, this period led to the division of the country, with northern regions now under Hyksos control and southern regions ruled by Egyptian rulers from Thebes. But it was precisely this struggle for independence and the desire to drive out the invaders that united the Egyptian rulers, what eventually led to the creation of a stronger army, the expulsion of the Hyksos, and the beginning of the Great New Kingdom, which was a period of unprecedented prosperity, imperial expansion, and grandeur, and became the pinnacle of ancient Egyptian civilization. It was these two transitional periods that became important lessons for Egypt, showing the vulnerability of centralized power and the importance of internal unity in the face of external threats. However, even the mighty New Kingdom, which flourished under the pharaohs, did not last forever. After the reign of Ramses III, who successfully repelled the invasions of the Sea peoples, Egypt began to show signs of weakness, and this led to the Third Intermediate Period. In fact, there were quite a few reasons for this decline, but we will consider the most important ones. And the first reason worth mentioning is, of course, the economic decline, as there was a reduction in the flow of gold from Nubia, loss of control over imperial possessions in the Levant, corruption, poor management, and frequent crop failures. These are the factors that led to the weakening of the economy. This was also reflected in rising prices, delays in issuing rations to workers, and the general impoverishment of the population. Another factor that should not be ignored was the strengthening of the Amun priesthood, because the priests of the powerful cult of the god Amun in Thebes accumulated colossal land holdings, wealth, and political influence. They became a state within a state, competing with the power of the pharaoh. The high priests of Amun, such as Herihor, actually ruled Upper Egypt, and even appropriated some royal titles for themselves, and this in turn led to the division of the country. Thus, weakened and broken Egypt became easy prey for external powers that wanted to control its immense wealth and strategically important position. The first thing worth telling is about the Nubian conquest there. The Kushite kings conquered Egypt. They had been under Egyptian influence for centuries and considered themselves the true guardians of its ancient traditions, worshipping the god Amun and quietly building pyramids. They ruled Egypt and tried to restore its former glory and ancient customs. Pharaohs such as Paye and Taharqa ruled there, doing so as true Egyptian kings. But their time in power was short-lived and unstable. Next, let's look at the Assyrian conquest. The mighty Assyrian Empire, which fought the Nubians for control of the important Levant region, invaded Egypt several times. In 671 BC, the Assyrian king Esarhaddon captured Memphis and expelled the Nubian pharaohs. And already in 663 BC, the Assyrians, under the leadership of Ashurbanipal, brutally sacked Thebes, which was the ancient capital and one of the richest cities of Egypt. This event ultimately shocked the Egyptians and became a symbol of the loss of their independence. But you may ask, what about the Persian conquest? Well, I want to tell you that it was the longest and most humiliating foreign rule, because in 525 BC, the Persian king Cambyses II conquered Egypt after the Battle of Pelusium. Egypt became one of the satrapies of the vast Persian Achaemenid Empire. The Persians often treated Egyptian customs with incomprehension and condemnation, especially at the beginning of their rule. This caused numerous rebellions. Although Egypt managed to briefly regain independence under several dynasties, the Persians returned to finally subjugate it shortly before the arrival of Alexander the Great, and it was during this period that Egypt, although formerly ruled by the pharaohs, was no longer truly independent. Also, let us recall the Greco-Macedonian conquest, when Alexander the Great, without meeting serious resistance from the Persian administration, annexed Egypt to his growing empire. After his death, his general Ptolemy Pharaohs founded the Ptolemaic dynasty. Although the Ptolemies adopted many Egyptian titles, including that of pharaoh, built temples in the traditional Egyptian style, and supported some ancient cults, they were still essentially Hellenistic monarchs. They ruled in Greek, and Alexandria became the new capital and the largest center of Hellenistic culture, science, and trade. Greek became the language of the administration and the elite there, and gradually began to displace Egyptian from official use. This was the last period when Egypt was formally ruled by pharaohs. However, their cultural and political essence was already mixed. And the last thing we will look at today is the Roman conquest. This was the era when the reign of the pharaohs finally ended with the defeat of Cleopatra and her ally Mark Antony at the Battle of Actium by Octavian. As a result, Egypt was annexed to the Roman Empire as a personal province of the emperor. And from that moment on, the pharaohs no longer existed. Egypt began to be ruled by Roman governors, and it became the so-called breadwinner of Rome, since it supplied grain for the imperial capital. Thus, the great era of the pharaohs did not collapse in one moment. It was a very long and even centuries-long process of gradual weakening. The reasons for all this were both internal problems and constant pressure from powerful foreign countries. In the end, these countries absorbed Egypt and forever changed its appearance. Descendants were ultimately left with only grandiose ruins and priceless written evidence of its past greatness.